Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to work on simplification. So I've chosen a very tricky photo reference. It's difficult for a number of reasons. Number one, it features figures, and those figures are in dynamic poses of motion. The teacher is a block of mostly black clothes here, so there's very little detail, and then the background is distractingly ugly. But sometimes this is what you're given to work with. And as an artist, you want to find the parts that you enjoy, bring out the strengths, and disregard the rest. So I'm going to show you how to go about making this into a stronger composition, and we'll work on making a watercolor study that shows figures in motion. So to begin with, play with cropping your reference material. I don't want to crop it so that there's anyone right in the middle of the piece. But even this is a lot stronger than what we had before. When we close the ceiling down, it does take on a much more claustrophobic, boxed-in feeling. So I'll tape my frame, and then I want to sketch this out so that I'm more comfortable knowing what goes where. So I'll use a 4B pencil and a piece of typing paper and just give myself a really quick study so that I have something more clear to look at for my painting. And the first thing that I notice is 1, 2, 3, 4 strong vertical lines that make up the figures. So I'm going to start by just drawing those lines as lines. Okay, now I'm going to block in their heads, the bottoms of the feet, and the center point of the waists. So this is really a gesture drawing more than anything else. It's showing me how the figures are moving. So here, this dancer, her arms come up and her spine is bending backwards. This dancer, she's bending a lot too. Really heavy arch in her back, lifting those arms. Legs are slightly bent. So what does this tell me? What useful things do I get from doing a character study? I get to be acquainted with the figures that I'm about to draw more carefully, and I get to do some more hands-on planning of my composition. I need to make sure that the teacher is standing more away from the girls so that it's more apparent that she's the teacher, and the proportions of her body are not quite right. So then I can proceed to do another figure study, or I can move now to my watercolor paper. Okay, to move to my watercolor paper, I'm going to keep the lessons of my character study in mind, and I'm going to redraw in the same way. But then, working that same way, but with a lighter, more careful touch, I'm going to first draw the head, and then the body with the arms. But I can finish this up off camera so we save some time, and then I'll come back to you when it's time to start painting. Alright, I have my figures very carefully drawn here, and so I'm ready to start painting. Now the problem that we're facing in today's tutorial is that our reference material is just way too boring. And so I'm going to show you how to solve those problems and bring out the beauty of the forms, the dancing girls, while getting rid of everything that is distractingly ugly or bare in the photo reference. So whereas usually we rely heavily on references and kind of copy what we see, making a few edits here and there, in today's tutorial I'm going to focus on a totally different technique in which the figures suggest an interplay of line and form to me, but I basically wipe out everything else, make my own colors and my own backgrounds. So the first thing I need is I've protected a few of the essential whites with some masking fluid. Not very much though. And then I need to decide what to do to strengthen the background forms. I have these very strong verticals here. I would like there to be some horizontal forms. I'll start there, expressing those forms with some cool colors. So I'll just wash in some blues, and I'll go right over the figure, making her piecemeal with the background. Then continue that blue shape down and around over onto this figure. I'm being somewhat careful. I have careful lines drawn, but I'm not being nearly as careful with my brush strokes as I was with those lines. And I'll come up here and I'll give this form a little bit of something too. Let's go in now with a pink color and just add something a little bit warmer here and there. I want some of these colors to sort of mix together on the page, and I don't want to lose all the lights on those hands. So I'll flood it down into the figure, but I'm not covering up everything. I'm going to flood in over here, and then just some nice, really wet flowing stuff here at the bottom. When your first layer is dried, then you can go back in and darken up the details in the figures, and then we can do the same sort of thing in the background. You don't have to work with any traditional flesh tones if you don't want to, but what you're trying to do as you work here is just create some interesting shapes that tell a story. I start with a flesh tone, and then I'm going to go and drop in some blues and some darks to better describe the clothes, and just let those bleed together. And I want to get some interesting things happening here on the board, so I'll just dot in some really bright colors. So see how I'm just filling in, and then I'm going to selectively choose a little spot or two to keep plain white. If the color gets too saturated in a spot, or you just don't like the way it's looking, you can lift up with a tissue here. Sometimes it's just interesting to blot out an area of the figure and leave it like that. And I'll do that same sort of thing in these other figures. I am keeping my reference close, and not for the color, just for the information on the shapes, because I want to accent the shadow shapes in this method and really focus on getting those down. Everything else is really an after detail. Thanks, honey. I'll go in and add these blue leotards and make one side of the figure predominantly dark and the other much lighter. So here I'm just going from figure to figure and working on the shadow shapes that I see, putting them in blocks of color that just continue from one part of the figure to the other. Now ironically, you need to have a really clean, clear, detailed drawing before you can work with confidence in this style. Because even though it looks loose and kind of slipshod, it has to be right on or it's not going to work. You have to know the exact shapes so that you can play with them and still have it come out as dancing figures and not just random blobs of paint. This is another really great way to focus, to strengthen your ability to see shapes and color, and shapes and shadow and light also. Here I'm going to blot this side of the leotard so that it stays light struck for me. And there's a nice play of lost and found edges. Lost edges are bleeding fuzzy ones, found edges are sharp and crisp. Okay, so let's let this dry and come back again. Now the painting is dried again, so I'm going to go back in another time and do the same sort of step, but I'll take off my masking fluid, and then I'll go back in delicately again with this small round. These delicate small shapes are what make the whole figure work. They explain how the hand is bending, how the head is tilting, and so on. And a lot of this step is standing back and giving it some breathing room after you put something down. There's a really delicate flow here from figure to figure. I want to emphasize what's good about it, clarify it, but not kill it. So this is a really careful, painstaking step in the process. See, I'm adding the darker shapes of the blue on top here, and that helps to emphasize the way that her body is moving. Then maybe I'll get the brush wet and wash out a corner or an edge or two to match the style better with what I already have on the board. Now I'm also going to slide in some yellows into my shadows in the flesh and just give it a little bit more colorful punch. It's going to help to emphasize, again, this is not supposed to be a traditional painting where the flesh tone looks one way and the clothing are very separate. It's supposed to all flow together. Now I'm also going to do a bit more work in the background, and I'll start by adding a bit more purple to this foreground mirrored suggestion shape. I like to add a little bit of color underneath that could be suggestive of reflections on the floor here. And then I'll use some of this up here and kind of carve out the shape of these hands. It's picking up this corner, and so the eye is going to bounce back and forth. but now I need to tie those shapes together somehow. So that's done somewhat here with this shadow, but then let's do something that will rainbow this across. Maybe a suggestion of that floor shape here. I'll add a bit of blue to the bottom of it, and then maybe just wash this one down a bit. This is a nice hard line here, and then I'm keeping a lot of these other ones softer. So you have a transition from soft to hard, and you have a lot of these different shapes playing together. And then I'll bring up a little square of yellow up here. So then you have this mimicking up here. And then I also want a bit of yellow then down in this corner. So I'll wash that into the figure here. I like that. So let's let that dry. And probably one more pass will finish this up. It's looking really good, really interesting. It really flows with good color here. So let me just use that small round again. This dancer in the background needs to have her leotard be a little darker so she stands out. Then I'll drop in some red just to help it bleed and make an interesting color. Then there are just a few places here and there where I want to clarify some shapes. So here I'll give this dancer an ear. I'll darken up the hair on the foreground here. And whenever possible, also leave a little bit of the paint that's underneath so that you get this cool layering effect like you see here. But don't kill it. The temptation is really strong in these final passes to make it just too distinct. And if you make this style distinct, then you're really going to kill the spontaneity of it. Less is more. To help yourself do that, after you put down some new additional color like that, use a wet, damp brush and just lose a bit of that line. Bleed it out. Which, of course, is easier said than done, I know, but that's why this is a challenging style, and that's why we're working on it this month. Don't think of things as literal things. Try to represent what you see in vague terms that capture the essence without being overly literal. Okay, this is our finished piece. Here's the photo reference that I started with, and here's what I wound up with. So I find that it's no contest which of these two images is more interesting to look at, and I'm pleased with the finished result. So it's fast, it's fun, it is challenging, and I would advise you to make sure that that initial pencil sketch is really clean and clear before you start playing with the paint. I'm going to upload the reference material for you to use so that you can use the same dancers. It's really challenging to get those forms right, but it certainly is worthwhile when they come off. So that concludes this month's painting tutorial. I hope that you've learned a lot, that you've picked up some techniques that you can use in your own studio, that you've had a good time, and as always, I thank you so much for watching.